Sony announced the PlayStation 5 Professional this week with a live stream hosted by Mark Mr. Knack Cerny, aka the chillest man alive, or at least the chillest man that they put on camera for these Sony events. I'm sure you've heard all of this already. You already know what the thing is. So let me just quickly speed run what the announcement was, and then we can talk about it, you know? So basically the reason for the PS5 Pro's existence boiled down to what Mark Cerny referred to as the big three. And the big three were a larger GPU, advanced ray tracing, and AI-driven upscaling. All three of those things were framed as being the solution to a problem that started in the PS4 generation, which is needing to choose between quality mode, which prioritizes graphics and resolution, or performance mode, which prioritizes frame rate. And Mark Cerny said that gamers that he had talked to were having a hard time deciding between the two, but he also said that 75% of the time, people were choosing performance mode. They wanted frame rate. They wanted a locked 60 frames per second instead of maybe a locked 30 frames per second, but something was in 4K, for example. He then went on to show a bunch of side-by-side comparisons of games for the PS5 on the PS5 and the PS5 Pro, and that was immediately dunked on by the wider internet. And then they announced the price, which was $700, which was immediately dunked on by the wider internet. And then they also said in the slide that says that it's $700, it also says vertical stand sold separately, which also got dunked on by the wider internet. My thought on that, real quick, is like, the reason that you put that on that slide that has almost nothing else on it is because your legal team made you, because you have the thing showing, you have the thing on a vertical stand. Don't put it on the vertical stand then. Like, it is so embarrassing to need to put vertical stands sold separately on the box that you're asking $700 for. But just have it sideways. The PS5 looks fine sideways. I mean, it looks, let me be honest, it looks bad both ways. It looks bad standing. I'm looking at mine. Mine's on the ground right now. It's on a vertical stand currently, and it doesn't look very good. And if I put it on its side, it also doesn't look very good. It's like a weird Oreo either way. But now it can be an Oreo with a racing stripe. So, you know, it's cool, and for gamers. Anyway, now you're caught up. That's what happened in the event. I have about 1 million thoughts about the PS5 Pro, a device that I am not going to purchase, if I'm being totally honest. But in honor of Mark Cerny, I boiled it down to my big three, which I am calling Compulsion, Context, and Legacy. Okay, so Compulsion. Why would somebody buy this? Why would somebody feel compelled to buy this? Why would they feel compelled to go out and purchase it if they don't have a PS5 yet? Why would they feel compelled to go out and purchase it if they already own a PS5 and they want to upgrade to the PS5 Pro? There are a bunch of people within Sony who need to answer those questions. The R&D team needs to answer those questions. They have a bunch of market analysts that need to answer those questions. They need to talk to developers and see what developers say about why they should answer those questions in the first place. And going back to the event and taking it at face value, Cerny said that he talked to developers, and developers were tired of choosing between pumping higher graphics out or prioritizing things like frame rate. They wanted both, which I think a lot of people want. A lot of people who are console gamers, they don't want to have to choose between that stuff. The more settings you throw at a console game, the less it feels like a console game in a lot of ways. The reason you buy a console instead of a PC in a lot of cases, outside of the fact that like, oh, it's the one that your friends use and you want to play FIFA online with them on the thing that everybody's using together, is you don't want to be messing around with the 1.5 billion settings in a PC game, which I understand. I was that person for a long time. I own a PC now. I like messing around in settings. I like tweaking little stuff here and there to see if I can get better performance. But, you know, for console games, it's pretty much like, does it run? Yes or no? I'm happy. I'm playing the video game. Great. That said, I kind of like choosing between performance and quality modes. There are some games that I think I enjoy the higher frame rate, and there are some games where I enjoy the higher fidelity. Sometimes, for example, if I have my PS5 plugged into my capture card, which maxes out at 1080p at the moment, then like there's no reason for me to have it bump in at 4K. That doesn't make sense. So I get a higher frame rate, and that's great. That's good for me. That said, though, right after the event, there was a quote from Mark Cerny who said that developers are already coming up with new graphics modes. So already, like, the pitch for the PS5, outside of like, oh, it looks a little bit better than the PS5, the pitch for the PS5 Pro is that you don't have to worry about graphics modes anymore. And yet we're already adding more, so that just goes out the window. So then you're really left with like, who is this for? I think if you're a person with the PS5, like me, the reasons to upgrade to the PS5 Pro are pretty slim to none, even. The one reason that I thought of, like, because let me be clear, I don't want to be a hater. That's the opposite of the energy I want to put out into the world. Usually I have a whole podcast that's just about games that we like. That's a good energy. I like putting that energy out in the world. But sometimes things like this happen and I'm like, I need to talk about it and I need to be honest about it. And in the search for truth and honesty, I sat down and I tried to write all the reasons that I would want a PS5 Pro. Like personally, like how would it fit into my use case? Why would I shell out the $700 for it already owning a PS5? And the one answer that I came up with was if I was capturing video footage from the PS5, it might be nice to have that be in like the highest quality possible so I could make these videos better. Like having 4K footage of Astrobot, for example, running at the highest frame rate that game will run at 4K, that sounds like a nice piece of footage to have and use for video like this. But is that a reason to spend $700? No. That's the reason that I could think about upgrading. And then if you're a person who doesn't have a PS5, if you maybe have the PS4 or the PS4 Pro, or you're an Xbox person or like a Switch person and you're like, ooh, do I want to get into the PlayStation? Just get the PS5. Just get the PS5. You don't need the PS5 Pro. You don't need all of that. The differences are so minute. And the differences are minute in games that we already have played and thought looked awesome. A game like Demon's Souls on the PS5 looks amazing. I don't need it to really look any better than that because, as I've said in previous videos, I'm not a frame rate person and I'm not really a graphics person. I'm a is the game fun person and does it run consistently person. And currently, all of the games, all of the ones that Cerny showed off in that presentation are games that I have played and enjoyed in the state that they're in now. And not once playing any of them did I think to myself, I wish this looked better, or I wish this ran at 120 frames per second. And I think if you asked most PS5 owners, they would probably agree. I feel like they would all say the same thing, which means for literally hundreds of dollars less, you could just get a PS5. And those are the two markets that this is supposed to be aimed at, right? Like there are only two kinds of consumers who would buy a PS5 Pro. It's people who want to upgrade or people who don't have a PS5 yet. And in both cases, the answer is you get a PS5 and you don't get a Pro. It is such a niche device. It is such a niche device. If you're one of those people, like, let me be clear, like I don't want to dunk on anyone who wants the PS5 Pro. Like if you saw that and you were like, I'm the person who wants that, please let me know. Write in the comment. Tell me your reasoning. I would love to know. Like I genuinely would love to know. Going back a little bit to the people who don't have a PS5 yet, I feel like there are people who are still waiting for a reason to buy a PS5 in a lot of ways. And for those people, the answer, when something comes along that does actually compel them to do so, the answer is still going to be to get a PS5. Like for a lot of people, there were games like God of War Ragnarok or Horizon Forbidden West that would have been the system seller for them, but because they also had that stuff on PS4, there was like no reason to upgrade in the first place. So there's a lot of people just like sitting on their hands wondering if there's going to be like the game that's going to get them to get a PS5. I think the answer to that question is Astrobot. But that's a hot take, I think. Well, it's not a hot take, but like when you think about it for any longer than 50 seconds, it becomes a hot take. Like you shouldn't buy a PS5 just to play Astrobot, but it is good enough to warrant buying a PS5. Do you see the distinction? Do you understand the difference between those two things? It's very important. But I think when I ask myself those questions, who is this for? Why would they buy this? I really do come up empty. And I think that moves us on to our next of the big three, which is context. My last video on this channel was a big video that encompassed all of my predictions about what I think the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be. First of all, I saw some rumors that the Switch 2 might get announced next week. I don't believe them at all, but wouldn't that be wild if that were true? I can't wait to be proven right or wrong on a lot of that stuff pretty immediately, if that's true. Anyway, what I realized while watching Mark Cerny talk about the PS5 Pro is that because it was PlayStation announcing this kind of generational upgrade, I was like, I don't like this. I don't want this. I think this is weird. I'm not super into it. But then I thought to myself, what if Nintendo had done the same thing like when the OLED came out? Like if the Nintendo Switch OLED Nintendo Direct was, and this would have never happened. Let me be perfectly clear. But a version of the Nintendo Switch OLED Direct that was like, it is just a bit more powerful. Your games will look better, etc., etc., etc. It'll just be like a better version of the Switch that you can buy. You know, like the new Nintendo 3DS being a more powerful version of the 3DS. I was able to run things like Minecraft and like Earthbound. That was a weird one. And the Xenoblade Chronicles demake. They were like, the Nintendo Switch OLED will have some like marginal power improvements. It'll be like the new Nintendo Switch or something. I mean, that would have rocked. That would have been so cool. And it made me realize that like, that's really, you know, I posted like an almost hour-long video about all the things I want from the Switch 2. That's really it, actually. That is all, like, what Mark Cerny said the PS5 Pro is in some ways the most succinct way of pitching exactly what I want for the Switch 2. You know what I mean? I just need it to be the Nintendo Switch. I just need it to play the stuff that I could play before. I just needed to do it better. And that's it. That's the YouTube short version of my hour-long video from earlier this week. And I think that's where context comes in, right? Like, because it's Sony and because it's right now, it feels almost like tone deaf to release the PS5 Pro as it is. Right, I looked this up. There are under 20 PlayStation 5 exclusives at the moment. Like games that you can only play on the PlayStation 5, there are under 20 of them. When I talk about like people are waiting for a reason to buy the PS5, those 20 games haven't pushed a lot of people to do it yet, or there were games that were PlayStation exclusive, but again, came out on the PS4, so like it wasn't a compelling enough reason. Because the PS5 was $500, and that's expensive. That's a lot of money to spend. Already, that was a lot of money to ask people to spend, especially like, you know, and they couldn't have accounted for this when they built the thing. I think a lot of people thought that this generation was going to go very differently, but like, especially during and post-pandemic, like dropping $500 on a video game console is a huge ask of somebody. And to now be asking for $700 feels wild. Like, contextually, considering everything that has happened with PlayStation this generation, like, that just seems like so out of touch. I think that's where Microsoft comes in too, because there were rumors that they were going to release a mid-generation upgrade that was called Brooklyn. Like, it leaked. We saw pictures of it. We kind of know what the deal was with it. And it seems to have gone totally silent. As far as we know, there are no like rumors pointing to that thing continuing to exist. It seems like Microsoft might have bailed on the mid-generation upgrade, which, like, maybe that's the right answer. They don't need to muddy the water by adding another more expensive, more powerful version of the Xbox. The Series S and X, kind of like an okay duology there. Adding something above the X, that's maybe a little bit too much. Like, it's really just for the diehards, just like the PS5 Pro is. It's like really just for the diehards, the people who like on their Twitter profile, on their X, the Everything app profile, they're like PlayStation for life. Like those people, man, those people, they're buying it. And I think that brings me to my biggest point about the PlayStation 5 Pro and how weird it is contextually when you take in like the history of the past, I don't know, 10 years of Sony and the PlayStation brand, is like the PS5 Pro exists to get rid of graphics modes. The PS4 to the PS4 Pro was the introduction of graphics modes. And when the PS5 was announced, the excitement around it was no more needing to decide between graphics modes. And that was like an exciting prospect at the time. But what I didn't consider, and I think what most people didn't consider, and like now you really need to consider, is that was true if you were going back and playing older games that were released on the PS4 on the PS5. There were games that like suddenly they didn't need to choose between performance and fidelity. And once again, like if you're going and playing Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart on your PS5 Pro, you might not need to choose between performance and fidelity modes. But we're not accounting for the game that comes out 2 years from now. Like saying we're going to get rid of graphics modes doesn't matter when the team making God of War decides to release the third in this God of War trilogy or whatever, and that thing comes out in a couple years and they want it to look as big and bombastic and wild as possible, making full use of the quality and the power of the PlayStation 5 Pro, and we're gonna be stuck with graphics modes again on the PS5 Pro. It's gonna happen again. Like, never has the playbook for PlayStation been like so visible, you know? It's like the PS2, huge success. Like, you can't overstate how big the success of the PS2 is. And then the PS3 is this company that is like so filled with hubris, walking into the next generation and being like, yes, this is going to cost $1 million, and it has a Blu-ray player built in, which was a smart choice, I think, in some ways, but it has a Blu-ray player built in, and all of this other weirdness that just made people not want to buy it. And it flopped. It was like not a success at all. Obviously, Microsoft ran away with that generation, at least in the United States. I think that that's an important note. But at least in the United States, like, that was where Xbox Live really became a big deal. Games like Halo and Call of Duty were like better and more fun to play on Xbox 360 because that's where all your friends were. Everyone had that because it was the cheaper device, and it's where everyone was playing online specifically. And then you have the flip of that in the next generation, which I think is very funny, is like Xbox, now coming hot off the heels of the success of the 360, walks into the Xbox One generation thinking like they're the new hotness. They rock. They're the best. And they goof it up like really at the starting line. Like, they mess up as horribly as you could. And I think in a lot of ways, and Phil Spencer has said this also, like, they haven't fully recovered from how bad the introduction, the first glimpse of the Xbox One was. Meanwhile, PlayStation, hot off the heels of failing in the PS3 generation and like starting to figure it out towards the end, which I also think is really interesting. They like started to get it together. The PS3 Slim was a lot cheaper. It was a lot better. There were a lot of games for that thing at that point. I got a PS3 like literally like right at the end of its life cycle. I played all of the Uncharted games in like 2 sittings. Rocked. Had a great time with the end of the PS3 life cycle. But going into the PS4 life cycle, you have this company that's like, okay, we got some mud on our face. We dust ourselves off. We've learned our lesson. Here's the PS4. It's a lot better. And they just like played their cards right. It was very simple because here was Microsoft with the Xbox trying to be like an all-in-one entertainment media device. You had an HDMI in and an HDMI out. There's like a bunch of weird stuff going on with it because they didn't want it to just be a box that played video games. They wanted it to be a lot more than that. But they showed it off specifically to people who play video games who were like, hey, you forgot that this thing needs to play Halo. Meanwhile, PlayStation is over here being like, hey, we made a box that plays video games and that's all it is. And also PlayStation Online is a lot better now. And then everyone gravitated towards the PS4. A huge deal. But then we get to a point, and I remember this really vividly, we got to a point where there were a bunch of articles with executives at both Sony and Microsoft saying, like, we are not at the point where we can launch a new console generation yet. We haven't hit that point. But there is clearly a demand for higher fidelity, for better looking video games at this point. And that's when you get things like the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X and S. The last stat I saw, and I'll try and put it up on the screen if I can find it, but if I recall correctly, it's like 14% of all PlayStation 4 players were using the Pro, if I'm not mistaken, which is like not nothing, but it's not a huge number. You know, it was like a niche device. And the PS5 Pro is also a niche device, to be clear. But, you know, the PS4 Pro is a niche device. And I think where that leads us, if you look at the history of the PlayStation brand and all of those consoles, we're kind of in this weird space where like the PlayStation 5 is successful, but it feels like a slow motion version of the failure of the PS3 in some ways to me. It's a lot of we're just doing the same thing, but bigger and more expensive. And like, that's just not sustainable, both for video game studios, but also for players. Like, it's expensive now. Every game is $70 and every box is $500 entry, but now $700 if you want to play it like looking the best. This is just a generation that I don't think needed a pro model of the PlayStation. I just don't think we needed to do it. And I feel this way, maybe you feel this way, and I know I've talked to a lot of other people who feel this way, but we're not even pushing the limits of the PS5 hardware already. So having a pro version of the thing that we haven't maxed out or even gotten close to maxing out feels like bizarre. And I don't know about you, but I'm always like really stoked about the end of a console's life cycle because you always get the like last swan song games that make use of that hardware better than any other game. Like, I remember Shadow of the Colossus coming out on the PS2 and thinking to myself, like, no other game on the PS2 looks this good and no game will ever look this good ever again. And obviously that was wrong because a lot of games look better, and even Shadow of the Colossus looks better because they remade it. But at the time, that was like a we're at the end of the console's life cycle. Here's like almost a preview of what we're going to get next with the PS3 when that eventually comes out. And that was really exciting. That's always really exciting. That's why I'm so interested in the Switch 2, and I talk about it so much, is because we're at the end of the Switch's life cycle, and we're still seeing games that I like kind of can't believe are running on the Switch. I know I dunked a little bit on Xenoblade Chronicles 3. That's a game that I wish wasn't on the Switch in a lot of ways because I think it could look a lot better. But it is amazing that it's on the Switch in the first place. And in a world where we just keep getting like pro versions of consoles, like you kind of miss out on that. You miss out on those teams that are able to harness that power and squeeze as much out as possible. Use all of their institutional knowledge from making games from the beginning of that life cycle until the end of it, and making something like truly, truly groundbreakingly spectacular right at the end before we move into the next generation. And all of that leads me to the finale of the big three, which is Legacy. And I think you can't talk about Legacy here without talking about Jim Ryan. He's the guy who was running PlayStation for the past however many years, recently left. He's the guy who also, worth noting, greenlit 11 live service games, most of which will not exist, don't exist. Concord, one of those games, for example. I don't want to dunk on the guy too much because he's already out the door, but we're seeing the like ripples of his legacy. We're seeing like the PS5 Pro. That's a thing that he had to have said yes to while he was still working at PlayStation, while he was still the guy at PlayStation. When I think about Jim Ryan's legacy at PlayStation, what I think of is like a guy who played it pretty safe. And that was the right thing to do in the PS4 generation. And I don't think that's the right thing to do in the PS5 generation. I think they need to get a lot bolder and take a lot bigger swings. Even a lot of the first party games, like the PlayStation Studios games that exist right now, are all kind of samey. You know, like third person over the shoulder kind of action adventure-y games. Some of them are open world, some of them are not, but they all kind of like look the same. They all are kind of taking that DNA from like Uncharted, specifically the success of Uncharted, and being like, okay, but it's Uncharted, but you're a god with an axe. And that's kind of the legacy that Jim Ryan has left, is like the PS4 was a great success. The PS5 is like kind of more of the same. I think people are starting to maybe not be as okay with that as Sony would like. PS5 Pro is too expensive, is a really niche device. I think a lot of people are like upset about it. And a lot of the games are looking kind of samey. And in a lot of ways, they are starting to feel like, now that they're starting to make film adaptations of these things, starting to feel like the video games are just kind of test beds to see what they can turn into television and movies. And like, we know how the Uncharted movie went. There was this era where PlayStation went wild, man. And I feel like Astrobot is such a great example of not only the kinds of games PlayStation used to make really well, but they also, in Astrobot, just showcase how great PlayStation has been. You know, recently the CFO of Sony said that they don't have enough bankable intellectual property. Meanwhile, Astrobot is a game where you collect 300 little robots who are all representative of some piece of Sony PlayStation intellectual property, you know? Oh, you're upset that Microsoft bought Activision and now they own Call of Duty? Dude, you have Killzone. Make a new Killzone. Make a new Resistance. I don't know, like, you own that stuff. I know it's easy to say just do it, like, just make a whole video game. Video games take a long time, they're very expensive to make, but like, you have the IP, you know? Across the entire gamut of every kind of audience you could possibly want to serve, you have the IP. Make a new Jak and Daxter. Make a new Sly Cooper. I don't know. Make a new... No, you can't make a new Spyro, because guess what? Microsoft owns that too. Microsoft just went and swooped in and took Spyro, took Crash. They have Crash now as well. Either way, you can't be talking about the fact that PlayStation doesn't have enough intellectual property in a world where Astrobot exists, and especially the week Astrobot came out, which is when they said that. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And that leads us back to the PlayStation 5 Pro. It's a device that I'm probably not going to purchase. I said probably. I didn't commit to it there. That was interesting. That was like totally subconscious too. That was like, that's interesting. I'm going to talk to my therapist about that. Now, I own a PlayStation 5 for two distinct reasons. Number one is that I host a weekly video game podcast, and it's very helpful to have all three consoles. I have an Xbox Series X, I have a PlayStation 5, I have a Nintendo Switch, and I recently got a PC. I also have a Steam Deck. So like, I could talk about pretty much any game that comes out on the show. That's very helpful for me, obviously. On the flip side, if I was being completely honest with myself and with you, dear viewer, There is no world in which I wouldn't buy the latest of a console generation. I'm an adult who has a job that I work 9 to 5, and I choose to spend the money from my paycheck on video games, usually. And obviously, like, I make this show, I'm interested in the video game industry at large. It'd be weird to, like, not have all the consoles and yet still be talking about, like, what Sony's up to and not have a PS5. Be like, oh, I only own the Nintendo Switch, but here's my thoughts on what Microsoft is doing. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But I'm still kind of in this, like, weird in-between place where, like, there are a couple games that really feel next-gen to me, but, you know, there's no game that really feels like it needed to be next-gen to me, if you know what I mean. And I'd like to see it. I'd like to get to a point where I'm like, now this is it. This is the thing that made the PS5 and the Xbox Series X worth it. And I talked about this in my Microsoft Xbox Keystone video about the Xbox Keystone that never came out. But in some ways, I think for Xbox, the idea of, like, generations is kind of fading away in general. It feels like the thing that they're focusing on now is not the box under your TV, but is instead, like, Xbox as a brand, as an ecosystem of ways to play video games. And that doesn't mean they're going to get away from making boxes that go under your TV. Phil Spencer has been very, very public about that. But it does mean that they're kind of, like, bowing out of the race in some ways. I don't think they're going to go and just become a publisher like a lot of people have theorized. I think there will still be Xbox exclusives that you can only play on things like, you know, the Game Pass app or whatever. But, you know, they'll still keep making boxes here and there. But they're not doing what Sony is doing. And what Sony is doing right now is, like, just following the playbook. They're just doing the same thing that they've always done and will continue to do until it fails again. And then they need to pick themselves up, dust themselves off once again, and have another PS4. So to wrap this up, I think, like, when you look at it from those three lenses, like compulsion, context, and legacy, you're kind of left with just, like, a bunch more questions and answers. It just kind of, like, boils up to a big, like, I don't know, I guess I won't buy one more than anything else, which is not how we should feel about a new console. Like, when the Switch 2 gets announced, people are gonna shit. People are gonna go nuts for that thing. I'm gonna go nuts for that thing, but everyone's gonna go nuts for that thing. Unless they do something so wrong, people are gonna go nuts for that thing. I don't want to lie to you and say that, you know, I was anticipating or looking forward to the announcement of the PS5 Pro, because I have, you know, as I've outlined, kind of felt this way about the PlayStation 5 Pro since it was first rumored. But I will say that I went into that event wishing that they would prove me wrong. I think that's the biggest thing for me, is, like, I tuned into that event because I was hoping that by the end of it, there would be a compelling reason to make me forget that I was a little bit down on it going in. But here I am making this video, so, you know how it turned out. We all know how it turned out. But again, if you're a person who pre-ordered the PlayStation 5 Pro, stoked for you. You know, if, like, really, the answer could be as simple as you are a person who didn't have a PS5 and has more disposable income than other people. That's totally fine. That's totally fair. Go ahead, spend the extra money, make the thing look better than ever. Maybe you have a TV that's, like, good enough to make that stuff worth it. I don't, personally. The only reason I upgraded from the PS4 to the PS4 Pro, I should note this, is because I was playing God of War 2018. When the game first came out, the text was way too small in that game, and I went to Best Buy to buy a new TV, a bigger TV, because my TV was really tiny and the text was so small I couldn't read it. And I was like, I think the solve for me here is going to be to buy a bigger TV. And I went into a Best Buy, and there were some, maybe the PS4 Pro wasn't selling well. I don't know what the deal was, but I went into a Best Buy and they had a deal where you could get a really nice, huge, arguably too big for my apartment at the time, and maybe arguably too big for my apartment right now also, because I'm using the same TV. There's a huge 4K TV that came with the PS4 Pro. I mean, come on. So I upgraded, and I sold my PS4 to somebody else, friend of mine, for, like, almost no money, and that's the only reason I got a PS4 Pro. So the conclusion here is that if I decide I need to get a new TV, I should go to Best Buy. Maybe they'll have a PS5 Pro there. be deeply on sale. Wouldn't that be nice? As always, thank you so much for watching this edition of Wavelengths, or listening to it if you're listening on podcast platforms. If you're watching, do me 2 favors. If you're not subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the channel. That'd make me very happy. And hit the like button if you liked the video. And if you didn't, I'm sorry to hear that. And if you're listening on podcast platforms, why don't you give it a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you happen to be. But that's it for me. I wasn't planning on making 2 episodes of the show this week, but PS5 Pro, man. What am I going to do? Not talk about it? No. Bye.